Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into something super relatable, I think, but also a little bit tough to face.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's that constant kind of tension between, like what we believe is right
Mhm.
ethically, and then what we actually end up doing. Sometimes those things don't quite line up.
Definitely. Like, we all want to be the best version of ourselves, but then life gets in the way, right?
Exactly. And what's so fascinating about the stuff we read for this deep dive is that it goes way deeper than like just being a good person or a bad person.
hmm
It's really about all these different forces that are kind of shaping our choices. You've got psychology, neurology, even like societal pressures all playing a role.
It's true. Like, nobody's making these decisions in a vacuum.
Right. Okay, so the sources we've got for this one, they start off with this like a really powerful analogy of standing at a crossroads. You've got two paths ahead of you.
Okay, I can see where this is going.
Yeah. One path, it's like the easy route. The instant
Mhm.
gratification, the quick reward. The other path is the one that leads to those like long-term ethical ideals, but it takes more effort, more work.
Like, I'm thinking, you're at the grocery store, you're trying to decide between, like, that bag of chips or some fresh veggies.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one.
The chips are calling your name right, but deep down, you know the veggies are the better choice.
It's that classic like battle between what we want and what we know is good for us. And the sources really break down the barriers that make it so tough to choose that higher path consistently.
And it's not just about willpower, right? Like, there's more to it.
So much more. Like one of the things they talk about is this thing called temporal discounting.
Mhm.
Basically, it's our brain's like tendency to go for that instant reward, even if it means like sacrificing something better in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Like, our ancestors, they needed to focus on immediate survival.
So we're basically wired for instant gratification.
In a nutshell, yeah. But, like, in today's world, it can lead us to some choices that aren't so good for us in the long run. Like, maybe we buy that gas guzzler car because it's convenient now, even though a fuel-efficient option would be better for the planet long term.
Ugh, yeah, the classic want it now versus good for you later dilemma.
Mhm.
Okay, and then there's this whole concept of cognitive dissonance, right?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It's that feeling you get when your actions and your values clash. Like the sources use this example of someone who's like really into animal welfare but still eats meat.
It's a perfect example because it shows how we try to, like, rationalize things to make ourselves feel better.
Totally. Like, oh, this one burger won't make a difference, or, I'm just supporting local farmers, whatever. Helps us sleep at night.
Right. It's like our brain's doing mental gymnastics to protect our ego.
And then there's moral licensing, which I kind of think of as like a mental reward system.
Yeah, totally. Like, you do something good and then you feel like you've earned the right to slack off a bit.
Exactly. So maybe I volunteered at the soup kitchen this weekend, so now I can totally justify buying those designer shoes I've been eyeing.
It's so easy to fall into that trap, though, right?
So we've got all these sneaky psychological biases working against us. But wait, there's more. We also have to deal with the power of our emotions.
Emotions can definitely hijack our best intentions, that's for sure.
Like, that feeling when you're in a super stressful situation and you just blurt something out even though you know it's not the right thing to say?
Oh, yeah. That's your fight or flight response kicking in.
Our sources give the example of lying under pressure. You might stretch the truth just to get out of a tricky spot, even if honesty is important to you.
It shows how those intense emotions can totally overpower our rational thinking.
It's like a full-on battle happening inside our brains.
And that's what's fascinating, is that there's this whole neurological component to these ethical dilemmas, too. Like, specific parts of our brains are duking it out.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. Tell me more about what's happening in our brains when we face these tough choices.
So picture your brain like a battleground with two opposing forces. The sources talk about this dual process theory, which basically describes these two systems. System one is like our autopilot mode, fast, intuitive, emotional.
Okay, right.
And then system two is the slower, more deliberate one that helps us think things through and consider the ethics of the situation.
So it's like system one is the impulsive child who wants the candy, NOW, and system two is the parent trying to explain patience and all that.
Exactly. But the thing is, system two takes effort. It's like a muscle that needs training. And when we're tired, stressed, or like caught up in our emotions, system one often wins.
Okay, no wonder it's so hard to always be ethically on point. But this isn't just happening in some abstract mental space, right? It's playing out in actual parts of our brain.
Right. So you've got the prefrontal cortex, which is like the CEO of our brain, responsible for planning, decision making, and all that good stuff. But then there's the limbic system, which is all about emotions, pleasure, and reward.
So it's like our prefrontal cortex is saying, hey, let's think about the consequences, let's do the right thing. And the limbic system is screaming, give me that dopamine rush, give me that instant gratification.
You got it. And that dopamine rush is a huge part of this whole dilemma. Anytime we get a reward, whether it's a tasty treat, a social media notification, or a wad of cash, our brain releases dopamine and it feels good.
Like our brain's giving us a high five for doing what it wants.
Exactly. And those dopamine hits can be super powerful, especially when they're tied to things like money status or social approval.
So it's not just about willpower or good intentions. We're literally battling against our brain chemistry here. But you know what I found really interesting is that the sources don't stand there. They go on to explore how our environment, like the systems and structures around us, also play a role in our ethical choices.
Totally. We can't ignore the impact of the world we live in. Things like economic inequality, institutional corruption, even just social norms, they all shape how we behave.
Like the sources talk about how when people are struggling to meet their basic needs, ethical considerations can take a back seat.
Makes sense, right? Like if you're worried about putting food on the table or keeping a roof over your head, ethical dilemmas might feel like a luxury.
They even cite research showing that poverty and inequality are correlated with a higher likelihood of ethical compromises. And it's not about blaming anyone, it's about understanding how our circumstances influence us.
Exactly. And then there's institutional corruption, where the systems themselves are set up in a way that encourages unethical behavior.
The sources use the example of workplace pressure to engage in fraud. And it's easy to say I would never do that, but imagine the pressure of potentially losing your job, especially in a tough economy.
It shows how power dynamics and lack of accountability can make it so hard to stand up for what's right. And this isn't just limited to the workplace, it's everywhere.
It's like that saying, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
And that corruption, whether it's financial, moral, or ethical, it can create a ripple effect throughout society. It erodes trust, it undermines fairness, and it makes it harder for everyone to operate with integrity. But the good news is that these systemic problems, they're not totally unfixable.
Okay, so we've talked about all these challenges. Now let's get to the solutions.
Exactly. What can we actually do about it?
Right, because the sources, they don't just leave us hanging with all these problems. They actually dedicate a whole section to interventions that can help.
That's what makes this deep dive so interesting, right? It's not just about identifying the issues, but also figuring out how to address them.
Okay, so let's dive into those interventions. Where do we even begin?
Well, one area that's showing a lot of promise is cognitive behavioral interventions.
Okay, cognitive behavioral interventions. I'm listening.
Basically, it's about rewiring our thought patterns so we can make better ethical choices.
Yeah.
Like giving our brains a tune-up.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I like that, a brain tune-up. So how does that work exactly?
Well, one technique they talk about is cognitive reframing. It's basically about shifting your perspective in those moments when you're tempted to do something you shouldn't.
Okay, so instead of focusing on that immediate reward, I should be thinking about the long-term consequences and how my actions line up with my values.
Exactly. Let's say you're about to buy that trendy new gadget, but it was probably made in a sweatshop. With cognitive reframing, you'd think, okay, am I really comfortable supporting a company that exploits workers?
Right, because that would clash with my values of fairness and justice.
And the cool thing is there's research to back this up. One study found that these kinds of self-reflection exercises actually increased ethical behavior, even when people were tempted to do otherwise.
So it's like we're giving our prefrontal cortex a boost, reminding it who's in charge.
Exactly. And another tool that can be really powerful is mindfulness.
Oh, yeah. I've been hearing a lot about mindfulness lately.
It's all about being present in the moment and aware of your thoughts and feelings without judgment.
You know what? I've actually been trying to be more mindful lately, and I do think it's helping me handle stressful situations better.
That's awesome.
It's like I have more space between feeling that initial urge and actually reacting, which gives me a chance to make a better choice.
And there's science behind that, too. Studies show that mindfulness practices can actually reduce impulsivity and improve decision-making.
So we're basically training our brains to hit the pause button before we do something we might regret.
Exactly.
Okay, but what about those external pressures? The nudges from our environment. Can we do anything about those?
Absolutely. The sources talk about these things called accountability nudges, which are basically subtle ways to encourage positive behavior without forcing it.
Okay, give me an example. I'm all about practical tips.
So one really simple but effective nudge is just using reminders or pledges.
Okay, reminders, pledges.
Yeah, like research shows that simply reminding people of certain guidelines can have a big impact on their behavior.
It's like a little mental sticky note saying, hey, remember what you're working towards.
Right. And these reminders can be super subtle. Like some companies put up posters with their code of conduct in common areas as a constant visual cue.
I like that it's a gentle nudge in the right direction. And speaking of the workplace, the sources also emphasize how important it is to build positive cultures within organizations.
Totally. Things like transparency, accountability, and strong leadership can make a huge difference.
So we're talking about things like regular ethics training, clear communication channels, and systems where people feel supported when they speak up about concerns.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where doing the right thing is encouraged and rewarded.
It's like shifting the norms so that positive behavior becomes the cool thing to do. But what about those situations where we're dealing with people who have totally different values than us? That can feel really tricky.
You're right. It's definitely challenging, but that's where empathy and understanding come in.
Okay, empathy and understanding.
Like research actually shows that developing our capacity for empathy can make us better at navigating difficult conversations and making sound judgments.
So how do we train ourselves to be more empathetic?
Well, there are a lot of great techniques out there. The sources mention things like perspective-taking exercises, where you try to see the world through someone else's eyes.
I've done some role-playing activities like that, and it can be so powerful. You really start to understand where the other person's coming from.
And the amazing thing is there's actual neuroscience behind this. Studies show that practicing empathy can increase activity in brain regions associated with compassion and reasoning.
So we're literally rewiring our brains to be more understanding.
I love that. But sometimes it feels like these issues are so big, so ingrained in our society, that it's going to take more than just individual effort to make a real difference.
I hear you, and that's why the sources also talk about the importance of those larger scale interventions. So what are we talking about here?
Well, things like promoting transparency in systems, making sure there are clear ethical guidelines, and holding people accountable for their actions.
So basically, we need to change the rules of the game so that they encourage ethical behavior.
Right. And the sources actually give some really compelling examples of how these kinds of policies have made a positive impact.
And it's not just about addressing the negative stuff, right? It's also about creating systems that actively encourage positive choices.
Absolutely. Like promoting fairness, ensuring everyone has equal opportunities, fostering a sense of community.
When we address those broader issues, it creates a more just and positive environment for everyone.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all connected and that our individual choices are always part of a larger context.
It's amazing to think about all the different factors that influence our choices.
Sure.
Like from our own brain chemistry to the systems and structures around us.
Yeah, and it's not about beating ourselves up for not being perfect. It's about understanding these complexities so we can make more informed decisions.
Right. Like I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that even small changes can make a big difference.
Totally. We don't have to wait for like some huge societal shift to start making more ethical choices.
Exactly. We can start right now in our everyday lives.
That's what's so cool about this whole deep dive, right? It's like we've got all these tools and techniques at our disposal. We just got to use them.
So let's talk about that. Like we've covered cognitive reframing, mindfulness, building supportive cultures, all that stuff. But how can people actually put these ideas into practice?
Well, it doesn't have to be overwhelming, just start with one small change.
Okay, one small change. I like that.
Like maybe try practicing mindfulness for a few minutes each day, or consciously reframing your thoughts when you're tempted to do something you shouldn't.
Or maybe it's speaking up when you see something that feels wrong, or choosing to support businesses that align with your values.
Exactly. It's all about taking those little steps consistently.
And those small actions can add up over time, right? It's like we're building momentum, creating a ripple effect.
Totally. And don't underestimate the power of community either.
Oh, yeah, like surrounding yourself with people who inspire you to be better.
Find your tribe, those people who challenge you to grow and support you along the way. Because we're not meant to do this alone.
This deep dive has given me so much to think about, and I hope it's done the same for you listening out there. It's a good reminder that personal growth, it's a journey, not a destination.
And it's a journey we're all on together. So as you go about your day, think about this. What's one small step you can take today to move closer to the person you want to be? What choice can you make that reflects your values and contributes to a more positive world? It's those everyday moments that really shape who we are and the world we create.